The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
In July 2021, Russia and China marked 2 decades since they signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation. The treaty became a central foundation of improved Sino-Russian ties in the post-Cold War period. To debate these and other issues, please join us and our panel of experts, bringing your questions, comments, challenges and insights. The event will broadcast live on all social media channels of the Democracy Forum.
Hello and welcome to our August Democracy Forum debate, where we tackle and explore issues that often impact all our lives. This month, our title is Right on the Nail, given the dreadful scenes that we're seeing from Afghanistan and the bruising that that war has inevitably given to America's standing around the world. Will the China-Russia relationship hold, understanding contradictions and convergence? Will it indeed? What exactly is this perceived authoritarian front against the Western democratic one? And to what extent have we been there before with the Cold War and the Sino-Soviet Pact, which one moment seemed unassailable and the next became frosty and distant? We have a brilliant panel to challenge us, and I hope you challenge them through the comments box and other means. They are Sergey, Radchenko, Natasha, Kuhrt, Eugene, Rumer, Marcin, Kaczmarski, and Maria, Shagina. Do you agree or disagree with what they're going to tell us? Let us know. Have they missed a fundamental element of the argument? Don't hesitate to say. And remember, if you're curious and don't know much about the subject and want to know more, the only stupid question is the one you never ask. At the end, Barry Gardner, MP, and more importantly for today, chair of the Democracy Forum, will give his assessment of the debate, bringing to bear his long experience on the front lines of democratic politics and the wider world. But before we begin, we go to Lord Charles Bruce, president of the Democracy Forum, whose skill at laying out the canvas on which we debate. Lord Bruce, so good to work with you again, and the screen is yours.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar, which has been convened to expose the nature of the relationship between Russia and China. Is it a tacit alliance or a marriage of convenience or something more sinister? No doubt our panelists will be keen to enlighten us, and I'm very grateful to them all for agreeing so readily to participate in the proceedings today. My thanks also to the team at the Democracy Forum for putting this event together, and to Humphrey Hawksley for, again, taking the role of moderator to steer us through this minefield of strategic intention and shifting alliances. In reassuring you that the topic for today's forum was chosen several months ago, with no premonition of what would occur in Kabul this week, I have to acknowledge, of course, that for those of you who are so well disposed, we are currently occupying some of the best seats in the stadium of world history. This is a febrile time for the Western Alliance, or at least the collection of economic and strategic interests that has bound the United States to its allies since the end of the Second World War. Writing last month in response to the foreign policy choices facing the United States, the historian Neil Ferguson reminds us of Churchill's speech given at Fulton, Missouri on March the 5th, 1946, when he referred to an Iron Curtain descending across the European continent. But Ferguson makes the important point that few Americans shared Churchill's pessimism at the time he made that speech. So why should we accept that China under Xi Jinping is behaving in ways that recall Churchill's characterization of the Soviet Union's expansive and proselytizing tendencies under Stalin? He asks pointedly. I suggest that this is the pivotal question which our panel needs to address today. It certainly looms large on the agenda of President Biden's National Security Council. The director for China, Rush Doshi, is in no doubt that the Chinese Communist Party now poses a challenge unlike any the United States has ever faced, and that Beijing's ultimate objective is to displace the US order globally and to emerge as the world's dominant state by 2049. But in accepting Doshi's analysis of Chinese intent, what role should we ascribe to Russia? Writing in Foreign Affairs earlier this month, Charles Kupchan, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, suggests that the Chinese-Russian relationship is grounded in a realist view of the world, and both countries reap mutual and individual benefits. It allows Russia to focus its strategic attention on its western frontier, and China to focus on its maritime flank. Russia gets substantial revenue from energy and arms sales, and China fuels the expansion of its economy and boosts its military capability. A more sinister interpretation of this tacit alliance emerged from a report published earlier this year by the Center for North American Security. The authors Andrea Kendall-Taylor and David Shulman explain in forensic and alarming detail how China and Russia have gone on the offensive to undermine democracy and universal rights as the foundation of the current liberal order. And they conclude that the impact of a Russia-China alignment is likely to be far greater than the sum of its parts, putting US interests at risk globally. As Neil Ferguson alludes, just as no one can quite be sure when a Cold War begins, nor can there be any certainty about the duration of such a war, those making United States foreign policy today must hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. It may indeed be a long game. Thus, the challenge facing Washington surely is to understand how it may succeed in drawing Russia away from the orbit of Chinese hegemony, as Charles Kupchan suggests in his paper, The Right Way to Split China and Russia, by changing the Kremlin's broader strategic calculus and demonstrating that more cooperation with the West can help Russia redress the mounting vulnerabilities arising from its close partnership with China. Surely, this is the critical diplomatic prize that President Biden needs to win. Well, welcome to the webinar this afternoon, and I hope you will be as enlightened as I will be by our proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Tacit alliance, marriage of convenience, something sinister, and a pivotal challenge to prize the China and Russia a little bit apart. Our first panelist is Sergey Radchenko, professor at Johns Hopkins University SAIS in Bologna, Italy, but he's speaking to us from Sochi in Russia today. He is the author of Two Suns in the Heavens, the Sino-Soviet Struggle for Supremacy, 1962 to 67, that was the pact that I was talking about, and co-author of The Atomic Bomb and the Origins of the Cold War. Sergey Radchenko will start the ball rolling with a broad historical perspective of the ups and downs of the Sino-Russian relationship. So Sergey Radchenko, the screen is yours.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very glad that I have this opportunity to speak to you today. I see my goal is as setting out the broader context of the Sino-Russian relationship. This relationship is centuries long. China and Russia encountered one another in the 17th century, concluded treaties, starting from the treaties of Nerchinsk and Kuhrt, that regulated their cross-border relationship. By the way, at that early period of their relationship, it was China that had the upper hand, and Russia was actually sort of feeling China's pressure. Then in the 19th century, Russia became much more assertive, imperialistic, helped itself to large chunks of Chinese territory, and really became a serious threat for China's very existence, as it were. A very checkered, very uncertain relationship. For my purposes, the key period of the relationship that we need to know about and worry about is what happened in the 20th century, particularly after the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. At that time, China and the Soviet Union concluded a treaty of alliance that was built as unbreakable and eternal, but it fell apart in just under 10 years. Historians have rightly asked the question, why? What actually drove those two countries apart? There are lots of explanations. I will just highlight, for the purposes of also saving time, just a few important episodes, which I then hope to compare to what is happening in the Sino-Russian relationship today, in order to argue that the relationship today is very, very different from the Sino-Soviet alliance of the 1950s. So we have to adjust our expectations accordingly. So one thing to know about the Sino-Soviet relationship in the 1950s was that it was hierarchical. In other words, there was definitely somebody on top, the boss, meaning the Soviet Union, of course, under Stalin and then under Khrushchev. And then there was the underdog, or the junior partner, or the younger brother, which was China. And China resented this relationship of hierarchy. So much of what happened in the Sino-Soviet relationship in the 1950s, China gradually pulling away. Eventually, there was, of course, a very nasty split that led in short order by the late 1960s to actual border confrontation, where the Soviets and the Chinese, well, they fought an undeclared war. How did this happen? Well, part of the answer, I think, is understanding the Chinese resented this relationship of hierarchy, and that the Russians were trying to dominate them or control them. And that, I think, partly is just a product or a consequence of the actual structure of the alliance as a hierarchical, rigidly structured alliance, which effectively forced China into following Soviet preferences in foreign policy. The Chinese were not happy with this. One example is their conflict with India in the late 1950s that boiled over in 1959. There was a skirmish on the border, and then in 1962 there was an outright Sino-Indian war. Well, in 1959, the Soviet Union did not want to support China, although it was an ally, but it felt like it did not want to lose India either. India was a friend, so it was trying to stay neutral in this conflict between China and India, and the Chinese resented it deeply. How could the Soviet Union not support us? We're supposed to be allies. Well, they're supposed to be our brothers, etc. So this is an example of where the rigid structure of the alliance itself forced almost Moscow and Beijing to play from the same, or to sing from the same hymn book. And if there was divergence, it really undermined the alliance deeply. Now, another example, again, from the history of the Sino-Soviet alliance, 1958, China, for its own reasons, starts bombarding offshore islands that belong to Taiwan or to the Republic of China, nearly bringing itself into a nuclear war conflict that could potentially turn into a nuclear war with the United States. What should the Soviet Union do? You would imagine that in the context of an alliance, the Soviet Union would be consulted, but they were never consulted. Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, was just doing his own thing, and it was sort of dragging the Soviet Union into this whole situation. Khrushchev, of course, deeply resented this for his own part, but he had to send out a letter to President Dwight D. Eisenhower saying, yeah, in case there's a war, we will back up our ally and we have the nuclear deterrent, etc. Did he know anything about what the Chinese were doing? No. So they had very, very divergent ideas and divergent policies, divergent agendas, but the alliance itself was forcing them to coordinate in a way that neither side actually wanted to. And that, I think, was one of the major reasons why China and the Soviet Union drifted apart. Now, another important reason, and I mentioned that because I think this is important for comparison with what we have today. The Sino-Soviet alliance was ideological. That is to say, both sides argued that they were defending Marxism-Leninism in their foreign and domestic politics, and they saw any kind of just even tiny departure from their preferred policies by the other side as betrayal of Marxism-Leninism. Furthermore, their domestic politics were closely interrelated with their foreign policies as a result of this ideology playing such a major factor. And this you could see, for example, in the 1960s, when Mao Zedong in China launched the Cultural Revolution. He had this idea that there were certain people in the Chinese leadership who were taking the path towards capitalism. He was trying to struggle against them. There was a power struggle, there was an ideological struggle. And in this context, the Soviet Union was also brought in as the enemy because he basically connected those people who were against him in the Chinese political context to the Soviets. And he was saying, well, the Soviets were betraying socialism, as strange as it sounds now, and so the Chinese domestic detractors, or Chinese Chairman Mao's domestic detractors, were also betraying socialism. Therefore, they were connected. Therefore, for as long as that situation continued, there was no scope for repairing the relationship. So ideology made it much more difficult to fix the relationship, which is why the confrontation between China and the Soviet Union, once it really picked up intensity in the 1960s, then continued through 69 when they had their undeclared border war, and into the 70s and all the way into the early 1980s. But here's an important point, which a lot of people forget when they talk about the Sino-Russian relationship. The rapprochement that we have today, something like in tone, you might call it, I don't want to call it an alliance. I think this is not an alliance, this is something else. But this process, whatever you call it, did not begin with Putin and Xi Jinping. In fact, already in the early 1980s, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev reached out to China, say, actually, you know what? We've been quarreling for all those years. We want to repair our relationship. And the Chinese reciprocated for their own reasons, because they felt that actually the Reagan administration at the time was playing the China card against the Soviet Union. They were not happy about being thus played. So Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader in the early 1980s, was saying, okay, well, let's try to repair the relationship with the Soviet Union. Gradually, this process started, accelerated through the 1980s. By 1989, China and the Soviet Union, then still the Soviet Union, normalized their relationship completely, fully, under who? Under Mikhail Gorbachev. That's actually one of the lasting legacies of Mikhail Gorbachev that people don't really talk about, because he's known as someone who opened the gates to the West and helped bring down the Berlin Wall, etc. He was so pro-Western and so on and so forth. But actually, Gorbachev was the one who also reached out to China. Why? Because he recognized China's huge importance for Russia, for the Soviet Union. Which brings me to a very important point. It doesn't really matter who is the leader of Russia. Russia Russian leaders and the Chinese leaders, actually both of them, they learned from history, and the lesson of history was that they do not want now to allow their relationship to be spoiled. They don't want their relationship to fall apart. And once it fell apart, it hurt both parties, it hurt both countries, and they worked so hard to try to improve this relationship. They continue to work very hard, and I think this is something that it's a political consensus that is shared far beyond just Putin and Xi Jinping. It's shared by political elites, both in Russia and in China. Both sides understand that a good relationship between the two countries is in the interest of these two countries. And furthermore, neither side wants to be played by any third party, i.e. the United States, which is why I think when we talk about splitting China and Russia, I think this is something that we should not take too far. I think this is something that is perhaps not particularly, this is not a particularly useful approach to the Sino-Russian relationship, in part because it misconstrues the complicated history and also misconstrues the lessons that both sides learned from this history. So that's, I think, as far as the introduction goes. I will be very happy to pick up on some of these points later in the discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Sergey, thank you for that. And interesting that you mentioned the Taiwan 1958, because that was actually when the US was preparing for nuclear strikes that I think the note that came from Khrushchev prevented. Just give us a difference between 58 and 62, when there was the Sino-Indian incursion or war or whatever you want, because there was a completely different relationship then, wasn't there? So could you just tell us in a nutshell the changes, because it's got a huge impact, hasn't it, on Asian development?
Absolutely, and by the late 1950s, really by 1959, the Sino-Soviet relationship was already basically in tatters. Things were falling apart. 58 and the Taiwan Straits crisis was actually an important a turning point towards this confrontation, a stepping stone towards it, and that is because Khrushchev just felt blindsided by Mao Zedong's action. What was Mao Zedong trying to do? Was he trying to cause a nuclear war? But if the Soviet Union was an ally, then what should the Soviet Union do? Certainly Khrushchev did not want to have a nuclear war over some islands off the coast of Fujian province. Yeah, that's from his perspective, this was completely ridiculous. So he had reasons to doubt Mao Zedong's sanity, for this matter. Never mind, to trust him less from this point onwards. And that really became clear in 1959 when the Soviet Union, when Khrushchev reneged on his previous commitment to supply China with a prototype atomic weapon, which he had promised to do in 1957. Now, looking at the events of 58, he thought, well, that's crazy. We should not do that. We should not give them the atomic bomb. Of course, by then, the Soviets had helped the Chinese tremendously with their nuclear program, so they got the atomic bomb anyway by 64. It's not like the Soviets won much by denying this. But anyway, by 1962, the relationship was actually pretty bad. Ideologically, they were quarreling about who betrayed Marxism, Leninism, and then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, when the Soviet Union and the United States stood at the brink of nuclear war. But it's interesting.
That was timed exactly to coincide with the Indian incursion, wasn't it? Almost to the day.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, it was a completely unrelated. Those were two different things, but they did actually coincide. And what's interesting about them coinciding is that at one point in October 1962, Khrushchev actually said, you know what, we should support China. And actually, the Soviet Union started to support China briefly, very briefly, in the Sino-Indian conflict. Why? Because if there's a war with the United States, well, as much as we hate them, we still want the Chinese on our side. This was the idea. But he changed his position on October 30th. 1962 for good reason. That is, by that time, the Cuban Missile Crisis was diffused. So Khrushchev was very pragmatic. But, the broader lesson of this whole discussion, I think, is what are we talking about when we talk about the Sino-Russian relationship today? It's a very different beast, because they're not in a formal alliance. They don't feel the constraints. They can sort of do their own thing. So today, for example, Russia can be neutral in the Sino-Indian quarrel. When they recently had the skirmish again, the Russians were like, well, we like you both, and we don't mind. I mean, we do mind. We want you to get along, but it's not like the Chinese.
If there was a China-Taiwan clash, they would stay neutral. Then would they now?
Yes, because they don't want to be dragged into some kind of a major confrontation with the United States. And I think the key thing, though, is the Chinese don't expect that either. I don't think the Chinese expect that, which is actually quite useful for both of them, because they understand that they have their interests, and they understand. I mean, a lot of their interests overlap and agree. There's a lot of convergence, as Eugene will tell you more about, I'm sure. But I think the key point is that they understand that they don't have to agree on everything. There's lots that the Chinese don't agree with. For example, they never really supported Russian annexation of Crimea. But, it's okay. They've worked it out. They know that they can get along without necessarily being on the same page 100% of the time, which is one of the reasons the Sino-Soviet alliance crashed.
That is a brilliant introduction. Thank you so much. And we're going to roll straight on from that with Natasha Kuhrt, who is the International Peace and Security at the Department of War Studies in King's College, London. She is also a founder of the British International Studies Association Working Group on Russia and Eurasian Security. And you're going to take us straight on from that, because you're going to examine to what extent Russia and China actually share ideas about regional and global order. Natasha Kuhrt, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. And I should add that my PhD was on Russian relations with China and Japan in the Yeltsin period. And so straight away, I just want to not really exactly take issue with, but just put a slightly different emphasis on some of the things that Sergey mentioned, regarding this very kind of longue durée, if you like, of Russia-China relations. So I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. Obviously, they are neighbors, and they have, as Sergey said, centuries of, interactions and so on and so forth. So you can argue that they've, in a way, never had much of a choice about being obliged to interact. Obviously, tensions came to the fore during the Cold War. But I think if we just rewind to the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was a very interesting period, because it showed that it wasn't necessarily inevitable that Russia-China relations would reach this kind of apogee, would actually, become as multifaceted and robust as they are today. Because in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and when Yeltsin became the president of the Russian Soviet Federal Republic, actually the idea was to, although they wanted to, of course, demarcate the border with China and so on and have good relations with China, there was a very big emphasis placed on repairing and improving relations with Japan, not least because Japan was a member of the G7, and Japan was seen as this kind of, in a way, a kind of Western Asian country, if you like, whereas China was seen very much as a kind of backward country, and as kind of representing a particular kind of primitive Asia with which Russia did not want to identify itself. So I would say that there were two Asias at the time. Russia very much wanted investment, and it very much looked to Japan. It also very much talked about upholding human rights and so on. It's easy to forget that now, but the first few years of Russian foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union were very different. And we can either say that was just a blip, and Russia has always been the same, an authoritarian country, or we can say, well, it wasn't inevitable at all. And there were particular reasons why this happened. But I think it's also interesting to look at the way that China viewed the collapse of the USSR. China itself really saw the collapse of the USSR as a very troubling development, and it reconfirmed China in the wisdom of its own path, which was about economic liberalization, but obviously not about freedom of speech and democratization, which is essentially what Gorbachev, of course, advocated, and which then, in China's view, played a big part in the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you could argue that Putin himself has very much subscribed to that view as well. That this was really perhaps a mistake, and had they followed the Chinese path, where one puts to one side human rights, in fact, argues against the prevalence of human rights, upholding human rights, and prioritizes economic development. So I think that's a very important point to make, especially as I'm talking about the normative dimension. And so as regards the normative dimension, I don't have a lot of time to talk, but perhaps in the discussion later, I would say that the two countries clearly both place a heavy emphasis on the norm of sovereignty, specifically Westphalian sovereignty. But at the same time, of course, they also insist on control in their own, if you like, spheres of influence. We don't like to use that term, but in a certain way, they are actually great powers in their own regions, or at least trying to retain their primacy in their respective regions. They both, of course, also resist, concepts such as responsibility to protect. Even going beyond that, they also tend to resist the norm that is often promoted, for example, in UN peacekeeping missions, the protection of civilians, because they see protection of civilians in these peacekeeping missions, for example, in Africa, as a kind of code for the insertion of human rights provisions. And this is exactly what happened over Libya, where the UN resolution talked about protection of civilians, set up no-fly zones in order to protect these civilians. And as far as Russia and China as well were concerned, they then overstepped the mandate, allegedly in order to protect these civilians. So I've been looking in my research at Russia and China in the UN, and particularly in terms of peacekeeping mandates. And I think what's interesting is that whereas until now, Russia and China hadn't very explicitly resisted, for example, the robust use of force to protect civilians, that they're increasingly voicing concerns about certain human rights provisions in these peacekeeping and particularly stabilization mandates. And this is obviously, of course, in terms of a kind of broader resistance to, the Western neoliberal order. So it's not just about these specific peacekeeping missions. It's not just about responsibility to protect. And Russia talks about setting up a kind of multipolar world order. China also talks about resisting and challenging US hegemony. I'd say that China tends to talk much more in civilizational terms, and one could argue that perhaps Russia has joined China in talking in these civilizational terms as well, referring to the idea of greater Eurasia, which would bring together the Eurasian Economic Union sponsored by Russia and the Belt and Road Initiative sponsored by China. In many ways, these civilizational kind of constructs are a way of sort of legitimizing, if you like, their activities, particularly, I'd say, in, for example, Central Asia, where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization very much embodies what some people have referred to as these kind of authoritarian or illiberal norms. So the kind of purpose, if you like, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is to fight the three evils, which are separatism, terrorism, and fundamentalism. And I think that this is particularly, of course, relevant right now, where we see with the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan, people are talking about whether Russia and China might step into this vacuum. We don't know what's going to happen with that yet, but certainly the kind of fear of fundamentalism spreading from Afghanistan into Central Asia, and as far as China is concerned, possibly into China. As far as Russia is concerned, obviously, it's mainly, its main concern is that that we don't see widespread destabilization in Central Asia as a result of this kind of security vacuum in Afghanistan. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was set up in 2001, and I think that this has really come to symbolize the kind of normative convergence of Russia and China, not only in Central Asia, perhaps going even beyond Central Asia, but it very much really speaks to the kind of defense by China and Russia of a kind of Westphalian idea of sovereignty, and of course also resistance to separatism. And that speaks very much to the kind of internal problems that both of these countries have. Russia obviously, has for a long time been dealing with separatist tendencies in the North Caucasus, for example, and China also has its concerns in Xinjiang. So there's a very strong domestic dimension to this. And I would suggest also the kind of joint resistance to the so-called colored revolutions, beginning with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, and more recently into 2014, the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. And for Russia and China, these so-called colored revolutions are essentially all of a piece, together with Syria, the attempted destabilization of the regime there. So regime stability is, if you like, also something that very much brings the two together. And this, I think, cannot be underestimated. This resistance to regime change has become an increasingly important part, I think, of this relationship. And I'm going to stop there.
A couple of quick questions for you from my advantage of being the moderator here. You mentioned Japan at the beginning. Russia and Japan still don't have they still haven't stopped the war technically, have they? Could you tell us if that impacts what we're discussing at all, or just enlighten us about that?
Yeah, you're right. Russia and Japan have no peace treaty. They never signed a peace treaty. Obviously, the main stumbling block has been the territorial dispute, because Russia has these Kuril Islands, as they call them, the South Kuril Islands, called the Northern Territories, if you're Japanese. Japan lays claim to these islands, but Russia says, no, we were given these islands. We were allowed to take these islands at the end of the Second World War in an agreement with Roosevelt. So essentially, they still haven't come to any agreement on the islands. I think Yeltsin tried to do that, but he essentially became, if you like, hostage to the kind of nationalists in Russia who essentially opposed any kind of territorial concessions. And with the kind of growing separatism in other parts of Russia, I think it became very difficult to start to give away territory.
So is this deadlock something that we should concerned about? Let's put it another way. Is it yet another trigger, like we talk about these triggers of India, China, and Taiwan, North Korea? Is it something we should be aware of?
I think we should be aware of it, but I think in a way it can be compartmentalized, unlike perhaps some of the other issues. It hasn't really been an issue in terms of the relations between Russia and China as such. It's really only been an issue in the sense that Russia was looking for investment at various points, and it has tried to kind of use the territorial dispute as a kind of leverage or bargaining chip.
And just quickly, because we're going to Eugene Rumer next, and I want to feed into this a little bit. I mean, the Afghanistan situation. Sort of, we all thought the war of terror was done, and now it's back on the table again. To what extent does this create more common ground between China, Russia, and the US and Europe in their need to prevent the export of Islamic extremism again? Is this a good thing in a way in bringing those powers together?
It's hard to say, because actually, if we go back to 2001, 9/11, the aftermath, Putin reached out to the US. He reached out to the White House and he said, look, now we've got this kind of common threat that we need to tackle. Let's tackle it together. But essentially, the White House wasn't ready to cooperate with Russia. Obviously, then Putin actually allowed the US to set up these bases in Central Asia. I think China wasn't very impressed by that. So actually, that's the issue. And again, Russia is saying we don't want the US to set up any bases in Central Asia, because there has been talk of that. So there may be some dialogue, but I think, that was a kind of moment that maybe could have led to cooperation in 2001, but I'm not sure that we could really go back to that time. There's too much distrust now, I would have thought.
Too much bad blood under the bridge there. Thanks so much, Natasha. We're now going to Eugene Rumer, Senior Fellow and Director, Russia and Eurasia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Eugene Rumer was a National Intelligence Officer for the Russia and Eurasia at the US National Intelligence Council from 2010 to 2014. He also has served on the National Security Council. So he knows exactly what it's like from the inside of what we're talking about. So what are the drivers of the Russia-China relationship? Will Russia eventually come to see China as a real threat in its future and us in the West as an ally? Or is this relationship based on sound strategic logic and shared interest? Tell us all, Eugene Rumer.
Thank you, Humphrey. Good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me. Just jumping a bit ahead of myself, I would say that I see this relationship as being very strong. I would also note that if Russia and China had a bad relationship, we'd worry about it even more. So let's put this in perspective. If you look at the bilateral relationship between the two, I would say that in each of the three critical pillars, the relationship is doing very well. There is a great deal of political compatibility and ideological compatibility between the two, as Dr. Kuhrt just suggested, with a view toward the international system, but also domestically. They both embrace authoritarian politics, and they view the United States and promotion of democracy by the United States and by the Democracy Forum, among others, as an existential threat to their domestic order and well-being. There's a great deal of economic complementarity between the two. One is really an infinite supplier of raw materials of every kind, and the other is a manufacturing powerhouse. And there's a great deal of geopolitical complementarity between the two, because for Russia, the primary strategic theater is in Europe, and for China, it is in Asia Pacific. So their critical geopolitical interests do not overlap. Now, turning to the military or defense relationship between the two, I would go back to some of the points that Professor Radchenko made and stress that the biggest gain in terms of security and defense the two countries derive from their improved relationship is in the fact that they don't have to do something, and that something is deploying something like 50 divisions on either side of the border, which was the case at the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and China, when the two, after the two had their brief military clashes in the late 60s. We think about our victory in the Cold War, our being the West, but I think a great deal of credit really belongs to China in helping us defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, because the Soviet Union effectively faced a two-front Cold War with 50-some divisions in the Far East, and then untold number of troops and divisions in Eastern Europe facing NATO. I think that lack of mutual threat is an extremely important contribution to both countries' national security and defense. Now, turning to the military cooperation between the two countries, I would say that there's a lot less there than meets the eye, or sometimes one reads about in the papers. These activities, such as the strategic bombers joint patrol in December 2020, or the announcement by President Putin that Russia would help China develop its early warning systems, they have a great deal of strategic resonance, I think, in the West and among those who study the triangular relationship between among the United States, Russia, and China. But in reality, they have little practical operational impact. If you look, based on what we know, at their military exercises, such as the one that they held just a few weeks ago in central China, those are not really all that big. That exercise, billed as a large Russian-Chinese joint military exercise, well, that involved apparently only 10,000 troops. It's not a whole lot. We don't really have a whole lot of insight about the extent to which the two militaries really operated jointly. For comparison purposes, the much discussed Russian military exercise in 2017 in the Western theater of military activity in Europe, Zapad 17, involved 48,000 Russian troops. But the two militaries rarely exercise the way NATO militaries exercise, where they develop the actual small unit interoperability, where they can really fight alongside each other. These tend to be more for show. The Russian-Chinese defense cooperation, such as already mentioned, the plans to ongoing activity to help China develop its strategic early warning system. We don't have a whole lot of visibility there, but it's fair to say that China has benefited very significantly over the past 30 years from the fact that at the end of the Soviet period, the Soviet defense industry ended up being basically broke. And in the 1990s, Russia did not have the defense budget to really purchase any equipment. So in effect, China saved the Russian defense industry and cherry-picked some of its most significant crown jewels, and that probably contributed a great deal to the development of Chinese military capabilities. However, China and Russia are becoming competitors in the global arms bazaar market, and Russian sales of military equipment to China have declined significantly. They only account for about 3% of the 100 or so billion two-way trade between the two countries these days. And Russia is likely to become more dependent as hardware becomes more technologically sophisticated, military hardware becomes more technologically sophisticated, and Russia really is a laggard in that sense and will grow probably more dependent on China for its high tech. Now, geopolitically speaking, not necessarily in terms of practical interoperability, partnership with China is a great multiplier for Russia. It is arguably a great multiplier for both Russia and China, but much more so for Russia simply because of its diminished stature on the world stage, because of its diminished diminishing defense industrial capabilities, and because it is widely seen as the declining power. Now, it can be declining for a long time, but the partnership with China really means that it has a superpower partner to stand up jointly to the United States, which both countries see as a source of existential challenge to their interests. Now, if I can briefly touch on what Professor Kopchin wrote something that was mentioned in the introductory remarks about splitting Russia from China. It's a popular theme in Washington, in foreign policy, national security circles. And I think it has, perhaps in the abstract, some merit, but in reality reflects a great deal of misunderstanding of how significant the relationship with China is for Russia. Just the very fact that the far eastern frontier is secure by means of a political agreement with China is a huge force multiplier and benefit for Russia in terms of not having commit vast resources to the defense of that frontier. Conversely, in terms of what the United States and its allies might offer Russia in order to split it from China, I think there's not a whole lot there. This kind of a super realpolitik deal would involve the kinds of compromises that I believe the United States and its allies are not prepared to even contemplate. And in a way, looking at the situation from the perspective of Russia and Russian national security decision makers, the fact that NATO has expanded to within 2 hours drive of St. Petersburg is something that really cannot be compensated by any assurances. So I would say that relationship is strong. It has strong foundations. It is well thought out by both sides. It benefits both. Now, this is not to say that there aren't people in Russia among the national security establishment who have concerns about the imbalance between the two countries, including the military imbalance over time between the two. But really, I would say that as long as this is Mr. Putin's foreign policy, the relationship will be decided at that top level, and the strategic partnership will endure. I'll stop at that.
Oh, thank you. That there was one thing you said there, Eugene, I have to ask you more about is you said China helped us win the Cold War, which isn't something we hear about a lot, as a lot of students in the West don't hear about the Soviet Union helping us win the Second World War. But did China know it was helping us win the Cold War? Did we know China was a sort of ally of sorts?
Well, I mean, it was a deliberate decision on the part of both Chinese and American leaders, beginning with the normalization of the relationship and Dr. Kissinger's and then President Nixon's visits to China, the opening to China, you know, the phrase Nixon to China, that comes from there.
Yeah, that's true.
It was I mean, I'm no expert on Chinese thinking, but from everything I've read, this was a deliberately calculated decision on the part of the Chinese to normalize or move toward normalization. At the time, you know, the Soviet Union was much, much more capable militarily than China, and partnership with the United States offered the Chinese, you know, the Chinese leadership a significant boost in terms of partnership, if you wish, in standing up to the Soviet Union. So I think historians will be, there'll be more dissertations written about this as hopefully more documents become declassified over time, although there's plenty of evidence already, and perhaps Professor Radchenko can add something on this subject. But really, the burden of think about the burden of maintaining 50 divisions. Obviously, not all of them were at full strength, but we talk about the Cold War being won by our ability to outcompete Russia in terms of our economic potential and build up of new technologies for defense for defense. Well, that burden of maintaining this vast military establishment, I'm sure counted for a lot when it came to calculating the defense burden on the Soviet economy.
So taking that analogy there, I just want to put it onto present day, something else you said there is that a super deal between Russia and the US would involve compromises not prepared to contemplate. So what compromises? Give us a couple of examples of the compromises that Russia would want that the US wouldn't contemplate.
Well, you know, one has to do with the so-called sphere of influence. Historically, Russian leaders really have a great deal of appreciation for what you describe as strategic depth. And that cushion of physical security that existed throughout the Cold War is now gone. And NATO, which Russian leaders believe is a hostile military alliance, is literally at the doorstep of Russia. So would we ever agree to compromise our Article 5 security guarantee to our Baltic allies, to our Polish allies, and consign them to the sphere of influence of Russia? The same goes for Ukraine, which is not a treaty ally, but we insist that, you know, one of the fundamental principles of our approach to foreign policy is that nations should be able to make their own decisions about their foreign policy choices, which is what Russia has claims Ukraine doesn't deserve. So that's one. I think we could never reconcile in terms of our, certainly rhetoric, if not actions, to the idea that Russian domestic politics and you know, suppression of free media and all independent political activity that we're seeing happening literally every day is something that is none of our business. There's not a whole lot that we're in a position to do about it, but we're also not going to keep quiet about it and pretend that everything that happens inside Russia is really none of our business. So those are the two, you know, there's harsh security and this kind of ideological incompatibility between us and Russia.
Okay, that's really, really interesting, and it goes on to our next speaker. This is a stimulating, it's fascinating exchange we're having here. Marcin Kaczmarski, lecturer in security studies for Central Eastern Europe at the University of Glasgow, the author of Russia-China Relations in the Post-Crisis International Order, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I noticed it was published in 2015, so you must have been writing it around the time of the Crimea and Ukraine flare-up, probably updating it as it was going to print. Marcin Kaczmarski is going to focus on the limitations of the Sino-Russian relationship and argue that they are far away from establishing a revisionist anti-Western alliance. Riveting stuff. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here. So returning to what you, Humphrey, mentioned about the book, that's right that I had to update it during the Ukrainian crisis. But at the same time, I remember that the majority of experts regarded that moment between Russia and China as one of critical ones, because they assumed that with the annexation of Crimea, Russia put China in a very uncomfortable position. And at that time, a number of experts argued that Russia-China relations would rather experience some difficulties than what we have seen, namely the opening and further cooperation. So I will try to explore this limitation, the limitations that we seen at that time and that we see today. And my main argument is that while the relationship has, without any doubts, has grown in substance for the last decade and a half, Moscow and Beijing are still far away from establishing a revisionist anti-Western alliance. There are still meaningful limitations as to what each of the sides wants to do to support the other, and what each side can do to support the other. I will focus on three types of these limitations. So firstly, I will start with the lack of support for each other's most aggressive aims in foreign policy. First, related to territorial aggrandizement and to territorial claims. And Sergey has already mentioned the lack of Chinese support for the annexation of Crimea, but it is also the lack of Russian support for Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. It is also the lack of support for primacy of Russia in Central and Eastern Europe, in broader Eurasia, and the lack of support of Moscow for China's primacy in East Asia. Moscow tries to do its best to maintain neutrality in China's quarrels with its neighbors, such as Vietnam or India. It attempts to maintain close relations with those two states, also in the energy sphere, in the military security sphere. So in those areas in which Russia cooperates very closely with China. And while I have certain doubts about the durability of this balancing act on the part of Moscow, given how asymmetrical Sino-Russian relations becomes, it is something which needs to be taken into consideration when we discuss what are the limitations of Sino-Russian cooperation, especially from the Western perspective. But looking at Central and Eastern Europe, China also does not want to see Russia dominating its neighborhood, whereas Beijing has limited its political ties with Ukraine. Economic relations are on the rise, and China is Ukraine's number one trade partner. So this is one group of limitations that neither Russia nor China are willing to support those policies which are most problematic from the Western perspective. But my second point concerns different expectations Russia and China have vis-a-vis the external world and the international order, which is supposed to replace the post-Cold arrangement. From the Chinese perspective, China needs a certain degree of stability, of political stability, of economic openness. China needs Europe to at least to remain neutral in China's conflict with the US. And what China does towards Europe is the exercise of moderation, combined with certain targeting of usually smaller states like Lithuania or Sweden. Russia, meanwhile, switches sometimes very, very quickly from offers of cooperation addressed towards Europe to military pressure, which we have witnessed several times every couple of years with Russia's Zapad exercises. So from this perspective, Russia much more thrives on instability, on disorder. It, as I understand the worldview of the Russian ruling elite, it sees instability as giving Russia much more opportunities than stability or calm international politics. And we have seen these limitations played in practice when China and Russia organized military exercises a couple of weeks ago. These exercises took place in central China. They were addressed, if we may put it so, to first and foremost to the US. On the other hand, we will probably not see Chinese troops taking part in Russia's Zapad exercises this autumn, although the Chinese troops took part in 3 previous editions of strategic exercises organized by the Russian Federation. And whereas their participation was not perhaps relevant in terms of practical cooperation, it was certainly relevant as a political signal sent to others. And with the Chinese absence in the upcoming Zapad exercises shows that China is not willing to align with Russia when it comes to Russia's one of most aggressive shows directed towards Europe. So the simulation of the conflict with NATO and with the West. And finally, my third point concerns the growing asymmetry of what Russia can offer to China and what China can offer to Russia. After 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the Russian Western crisis, we saw that China had economic potential to support Russia. It decided not to use most of this potential. It directed its support very specifically mostly to those oligarchs or Russian state businesses close to Vladimir Putin, close to the Kremlin. But in general, China limited itself to political support for Russia. On the other hand, after the Sino-American rivalry entered its new phase after 2017, 2018, Russia turned out to be willing and capable of supporting China in political and military security domains. My predecessor already mentioned the issue of the joint exercises of Russia supporting China in the construction of the early warning missile system. But what I would like to emphasize is that Russia does not have capability, even if it has political will to support China. It does not have capability to support China in those sectors in which the Sino-American competition and Sino-American rivalry matters most, in such areas as high technology. Once China is cut off from the Western technologies, Russia will not provide these technologies. Once certain markets are closed for Huawei, the Russian market can remain open to Huawei, but it won't offer those opportunities that were offered by the US market, by the European markets. Once Chinese companies are delisted from the New York Stock Exchange, they won't go to the Moscow Stock Exchange. So in this sense, Russia will not offer support in the economic areas, in high technology spheres. It will not be able to help China in those areas in which which decide about the future of the Sino-American conflict. And to conclude, what in my perspective does it mean for the West? I would say that the West still faces two parallel challenges, one that comes from Russia and one that comes from China. And naturally, their actions often coincide. We saw almost simultaneous pressure of Russia on Ukraine and of China on Taiwan. But still, I would conclude that the West does not face an aggressive revisionist alliance at this moment. And such an alliance, whether formal or informal, but understood as a tight coordination of pressure against the West, is still a distant possibility. And I would stop here.
Thank you. I was typing out a question to ask you halfway through that, and now I'm going to reverse it because the parallel tracks seem very interesting. But in all the talk that there's been about the Indo-Pacific and the Quad and that sort of thing, combating the rise of China, I was going to ask you, is that terminology wrong? And should it have been the rise of China and Russia or the alliance of China and Russia? But from what you're saying, that is not the case. Am I reading that right?
That's right. I would say that the main point here is that it is the rise of China, and Russia is a sui generis supplement to the rise of China. And one day in the future, we can speculate whether we will see Russia's subordination to China's strategic needs. But yes. I wouldn't say that we have an opposite pole of the Sino-Russian geopolitical center, which we have to face.
Which brings me onto another question. It sort of comes from pulling in what the other panelists have said, but also there is a relationship there, and it might be parallel, but it is sort of aligned in a certain ways. Is there a particular trigger that you can see that would split it? I mean, we talked about Ukraine. We heard earlier about the 1958 attack on Taiwan, that sort of thing. Is there something, say, in those trigger points that we've talked about, or North Korea, Taiwan, India, or something, that Moscow would say, no, we've had enough of Beijing. We have to take the West side on this?
I would reverse my answer. I would say that the question is, how far is going China to withstand Russia's political military brinkmanship, which quite often brings generates troubles for China. So if we look at the case of Ukraine, China had plans to use Ukraine as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Because of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, this part of the Belt and Road Initiative is practically closed for China. So I would say that the trigger could be on the Chinese side. When it comes to Russia, I would see the possibility of a domestic change, which would rearrange the thinking in Moscow and within the Russian elites, because I disagree with what Sergey started with, that there is a broad consensus in Russia about the Sino-Russian relationship. I would say that it is rather the suppression of those voices who would be skeptical towards the growing cooperation. And in the case of a far-reaching domestic change, I would expect that the relationship with China would be thought through once again within the Russian elite.
Okay, that's interesting. It all seems very fluid, but we're now going to Maria Shagina, postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Eastern European Studies at the University of Zurich, speaking to us from Switzerland. She's a member of the Geneva International Sanctions Network at the Graduate Institute's an expert on that, and her research interests cover international sanctions, energy politics, with a particular focus on post-Soviet states. So Maria Shagina is going to take us into the heart of the deals that are being done and the sanctions that are impacting us, to speak about Russia, China, economic and energy ties, and how they are handling Western sanctions. Over to you, Maria Shagina.
Thank you, Humphrey, for the invitation. Glad to be here in such an esteemed audience and to talk about a very important topic. As was indicated, I'll try to unpack the economic dimension of the Sino-China relationships, in particular after the introduction of Western sanctions. But before I do that, I would like to also share my views on the nature of the Sino-Russian relationship and where we are. It's important to know that the West often overestimates and underestimates the Sino-Russian relationships at the same time. It often simplifies or overhypes what's going on between the two by labeling them entente or alliance and so on. So it's important to have a nuanced analysis and to unpack the complexities. A lot has been done by the previous speakers in the military domain, also how they share their views on the international order. I'll try to do that about the economic dimension. It's fair to say that their relationship has grown, have strengthened over the past few years, and their ties are stronger than ever before. At the same time, it doesn't constitute an alliance. It's important to say that they are strategically autonomous actors that have their own interests, priorities, and agendas. They have a number of convergences, primarily the economic convergence is the pillar of Russia's pivot to Asia, to China in particular. They also share the resentment of the US-led international order, but it was pointed out by Marcin, the views on how to build this international order, post-West international order, is very much different. Whereas China is a system player, it has profited from globalization. It wants to reshape the international order as it sees, perhaps in the form of G20. Russia is a system disruptor, and we've seen with the adventures that have been done in Ukraine, Syria, and so on. This is something that worries China as well as an unpredictable partner. Russia also wants to be a swing player, to be a sort of arbiter between the US and China. It wants to establish the concert of great powers, something, again, that doesn't bode well with Chinese point of view. Also, there is a list of inherent convergences on political issues. State sovereignty is this whole grail of how things should be done, external interference in domestic affairs, is not accepted, and the countries share their views on internet governance, on human rights when it comes to Uyghur or Hong Kong. Also recently, they have started to emulate their strategies when it comes to disinformation, and the COVID pandemic has underlined that. Personal ties between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping has glued this partnership closer together. They have met more than 30 times before, but it's not the quantity of the times they have met. The former Japanese Prime Minister also was a frequent visitor to Russia, but that has not resulted in such a close partnership. Both countries share their views that strategic stability is important to them. In the more fluid and uncertain world, both are interested in having some sort of regional stability, and the demarcation of their border was this important factor that solidified their relationship, and neither side wants to have deterioration in their relationship in the future. So they agreed to some sort of accommodation in different areas where they have different views, but they have managed, and so far we have not seen the spillover in the Arctic, Central Asia, and the Far East, the areas of contestation. It's important to say that both want to preserve their strategic autonomy and flexibility. This is something that both cherish, and the only avenue where they try to coordinate their foreign policy is the UN Security Council when it comes to Syria, but other international institutions, we have not seen much of coordination when it comes to decision-making in Syria, for example, or Ukraine. So that means there is an inherent limit to the way how far they can form an alliance, if any, and how far they can coordinate between each other. As was pointed out, China took a very neutral stance on the annexation of Crimea, and Russia also does not want to interfere in China's spheres, again, of influence, for example, in the South China Sea, and Russia is very much keen on staying neutral on the current US-China trade war. While this is not marriage made in heaven, it works. We have to acknowledge that. And why? Simply because Beijing is very careful of how to treat Russia. It reads Russia very well, probably better than other Asian countries, and I have Japan here on my mind. China gives Russia what it wants, and it's basically put it in the limelight. It gives the international prestige that Russia craves so much, and it also very careful of not underlining its junior status position. So the asymmetry is inherently there, and the economic dimension is where it's very much pronounced. Russia plays a second fiddle in this area. While there is an economic complementarity, China is Russia's largest partner, trading partner, and Russia supplies oil and gas to China. It's one of the major suppliers to that. At the same time, the trade balance is very asymmetric. China's exports are twice as much to Russia than Russia's exports to China. The trademark that was sent, the benchmark that was set of reaching 200 billion by 2020 was not reached. It was pushed to 2024, but it's unlikely that it will be reached. China shares in Russia's trade turnover has grown to 18% from 10% in the 2010s. At the same time, Russia's share in China's trade structure is quite minimal. It's around 2.3%. The situation with foreign direct investments is even worse. Chinese foreign direct investments in Russia constitute less than, so it's around 1.5%. given how much China invests in other countries like Africa and the Middle East, this is a very marginal figure. In the East, in the Russian Far East, China is the largest investor, but that constitutes less than 2% of all Chinese investments in Russia. So we've seen that Russia is not very keen on investing in Russia, in particular in the Far East. And the reasons are basically of structural reforms, of economic reforms that have not been done. We're talking about the lingering mistrust between the two, corruption, administrative hurdles. China sometimes doesn't know how to deal with Russia. It knows two modes of cooperation, either is Western countries or developing countries like in Africa. And for China, Russia is, as was said by the Chinese businessman, is neither mature nor understood. So sometimes it just doesn't have regional expertise and understanding how it works. The hydrocarbons is this underpinning fundament that glues the two together. And this relationship has not changed for the past 20 years. China accepts Russian oil. Russia became the major supplier to China, even replacing Saudi Arabia. The Russian supplies of gas started with the power of Siberia in 2019. At the same time, Russia is one of the many suppliers to China. China has been very clever in diversifying its suppliers. So it's not dependent on Russia very much, as Russia is more dependent to pivot away from Europe, especially after sanctions. So it has a much weaker position. With the introduction of Western sanctions, there have been an acceleration of Russia's pivot to Asia, in particular to China, but it has not been obviously the point of departure for that. So what has changed with the introduction of sanctions? First, Russia was forced to open up its upstream sector, and we've seen major equity ownership by Chinese companies in Russia's energy projects. For example, Yamal LNG, 30% is owned by Chinese companies. The next one is Arctic LNG 2, also with Chinese presence. Russia's petrochemical plant, Sibur, has now 10% owned by Sinopec, by Chinese company. At the same time, while China emerged as this new export market for hydrocarbons, it has leveraged its position in many ways. First of all, it leveraged prices and conditions, and here power of Siberia is the primary example. China has increased the price, also defined the volumes and tariffs, and even the route through which it can go, which would be more favorable to China. China also used Russia as a testing ground for its new technology and equipment. For example, at Arctic Yamal LNG, owned by Novatek, China has supplied 80% of its equipment. In the sector where China did not dominate before, Western companies dominated, but it had used it as a platform to develop it. It's not keen on giving this technology to Russia, so all of the binding agreements that are signed, financing in exchange for technology, this technology is not developed by the Russian state. So basically, it's detrimental to Russia's import substitution, which aims to strengthen Russia's self-sufficiency. Also, in terms of de-dollarization, China has gained some ground in terms of internationalization of its currency, while Russia tends to export now its hydrocarbons dominated in the euro. The Chinese are keen to ship their goods dominated in yuan. So there is, again, this asymmetry between the two. Other sanctions that were now imposed on China have shaped Chinese presence in the high-tech sector in Russia. For example, Huawei has expanded its presence in Russia. It has partnered with Russian universities, establishing R&D centers, trying to penetrate 5G sector, an important one. At the same time, there are limitations to the extent it can penetrate it, because Russia is very much aware of what it means and wants to securitize it. It cannot produce the same type of technology, and again, its import substitution is lagging behind, but Chinese are now gaining the ground in this area. So it's important to say that in 2014, Russia had this heightened expectations that China will swoop in, step in, and help to compensate the pressure from Western sanctions. It did not do so, simply because the Chinese ties with the West were much more important and much closer than with Russia's, and Chinese private sector did not want to jeopardize its relationship at the threat of being sanctioned by the US. So this sobering assessment of what China can do came at around 2016, when there was some sort of formula worked out how to deal with Russia's sanctioned company. And basically all funding, for example, Yamal LNG, Arctic LNG 2, came from government-backed companies, which would basically minimize their exposure to US sanctions. And again, all of the deals that were done required high-level political support, and China has learned how to do business with Russia, with important people from the inner circle. So where does this leave with the future Russia-China relations? It's important to say that the international environment is likely to shape the Sino-Russian relationship than the two as autonomous factors. Russia's relationship with the West, in particular with the US, and the same China's relationship with the US in terms of trade war, will likely to shape how far they will be close together. And we're likely to see the continuation of the same strategic partnership, but much closer in terms of economic and political ties. It's not likely to transcend in some sort of new relationship. The asymmetry is not likely to disappear, and China will have a better leverage vis-a-vis Russia. Because there is lack of alternatives for Russia, Western sanctions are not going away. Russia will be forced to pivot to Asia, but also to other countries like Japan, India, and Vietnam. And it has tried to distance itself from China and not to have this excessive dependence in terms of technology, financing, or export markets. And also, the two are on a learning curve. They're learning how to deal with each other in terms of regional expertise, language expertise, how to tap each other's markets. And this is something that might improve their relationship in the future. The decarbonization is likely to reshape their energy cooperation, and it's potentially will pivot to the supply of blue hydrogen and rare earth metals, but this is something that we can discuss in the future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much for that detail that you gave us there. That was really interesting. Now, tell me if I got this right, and then I want to ask you a question on the back of it. After the Crimea sanctions came in, Exxon had to pull out of the Yamal project, and essentially China moved in. Of course, there were sort of hoops to get through. But so the US influence on that vanished and the Chinese influence increased. And you've spoken to us a lot about these deals and that coming through. If this new Cold War, for want of a better word, ramps up and more sanctions come on, is it these economic energy deals that is going to tie this relationship together more and more?
It is the pivot that ties them together. It is this pillar that bounds them, but at the same time, China is not ready to to fund everything, and it has proven it. For example, it did not acquire equity in the Rosneft, Vostok Oil, another Arctic project. It did not provide 25 billions for Gazprom to build Power of Siberia. At the same time, as I said, when it comes to the Arctic, Russia is particularly sensitive, where what China can fund and what it means for critical infrastructure. So while Russia can allow China to participate in economic projects in the Arctic, in particular on its own terms, it's also careful where China can have a say. For example, port infrastructure in the Arctic will be something very critical for Russia to allow Chinese presence. So there are limitations on both sides.
Yeah. Okay. Now that is fascinating. We've now got about 15 minutes for the questions that have been coming in that I'm going to go around the panel. So before we go to Barry Gardner. And I wanted to put out a big one from Raj Shukla. Will the US exploit Sino-Russian differences? I'd like to go to Sergey Radchenko for that, particularly because he could come in also about whether China did or did not help the US win the Cold War. Sergey Radchenko?
That's $1 million question. And this is precisely the question that people are asking, because if China helped the United States win the Cold War, if we're in a new Cold War with China now, can't we actually get Russia to help us win this Cold War with China, or at least neutralize Russia? And this is, of course, where people like Charles Kupchan come in and saying, let's split China and Russia. Here's the problem, the key problem with this argument. When Kissinger went on his secret visit to China in 1971, China and the Soviet Union were already at each other's throats. I mean, they came to the brink of a nuclear war. They had already a huge falling out. So it was possible to make use of their contradictions, and Kissinger very skillfully did that. Whereas now we're in a very different situation. Russia and China are in their best phase ever. So to say that the United States can come in and play and do the Kissinger thing, do the Nixon-Kissinger thing in Russia, I think is to misconstrue the history of this relationship.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to go around the whole of the panelists on this question. So, if you could keep your answers short, and then we're going to move on to another. Natasha Kuhrt, same question. Will US exploit Sino-Russian differences?
No, they can't. I'm afraid I do agree with Sergey and Marcin, and I think wrote an article on that for the Diplomat. I think it's a very, very different environment now. I mean, China needed recognition. It wanted a seat on the UN, on the UN Security Council. There just isn't the same kind of leverage at the moment. I don't think China really needs that kind of recognition.
Yeah, you went into some very good detail there on how they work on particularly on the peacekeeping elements of the Security Council. Eugene, Rumer?
Well, I absolutely agree with my colleagues that this is A, improbable, and B, frankly, impossible, because I just don't think that our diplomacy is capable of the kind of agile maneuvering that Dr. Kissinger was engaged in when he was in charge. I just think that we've sort of moved way past that stage.
Is there a sort of a lobby within Washington for this, or is it completely off the cards?
Well, there's a lobby for this. There are people who sort of see this picture in the grand strategic terms, but I don't think they really understand what's at stake for the two countries, certainly for Russia. And there is this lingering view of Russia as an incapable actor on the world stage that goes back to the 1990s. So I think Russia has evolved, has changed significantly since then, and its diplomacy has been better resourced and quite agile. And that's what I think they don't quite understand. And again, to repeat my previous points, what are they prepared to offer to the Russians in exchange for switching sides?
Yeah. How much they? Thank you for that. I want to see if we have unity amongst the panelists. So, Marcin, Kaczmarski, can you briefly deal with will US exploit Sino-Russian differences?
I can only agree with my predecessors to reiterate that I don't think it is possible. We need to remember that from the Russian regime's perspective, the West is not the threat only to Russia's interest. It is the threat to the regime itself. And it is not the case with China. So even the power asymmetry does not make the Kremlin fear China's rising power.
Okay. And Maria Shagina, can you just add a word to that?
Because this statement is actually used as an argument that we need to lift the sanctions on Russia because there will be this alliance between Russia and China. And I think I agree with the others, it misunderstands what Russia wants from the West, whether it trusts the West, whether they would buy what the West has to offer. And also it misunderstands sanctions as an instrument that just writing a blank check on Russia's transgressions in the past is not going to change it behavior.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a lot of questions coming in about Afghanistan and how that is going to change the layout in Central Asia, Islamic extremism. And I wondered if I could go around again, starting with Sergey Radchenko, just to deal with that in a nutshell. How do you see the China-Russia relationship unfolding with the US with what has happened in Afghanistan?
Well, I don't understand can you hear me now? Yes, I don't understand all the excitement about China or Russia potentially getting into Afghanistan and making something out of it. I mean, if the Chinese are silly enough to do that, they will learn a lesson. I don't think they are. If they manage to stabilize the regime or work out something with the Taliban, well, all the power to them. Why should we be so unhappy about it? More broadly about Central Asia, I see there are several questions about whether China and Russia can come to can have frictions in Central Asia. I think this tends to somehow overlook the factor of how the Central Asians themselves, that is to say, people in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, how they see Chinese infiltration of the region. There's actually some anti-Chinese sentiment there among the people, and there's no great eagerness to sell themselves out to the Chinese to any great degree. So I think actually Central Asian players are very astute in balancing Russia and China.
Right. Natasha, any views on that, or to add to what Sergey Radchenko said?
Yeah, I want to also agree with Sergey that these kind of articles that everyone's writing saying, nature abhors a vacuum and Russia and China will somehow inevitably fill that vacuum. I don't think it's going to work like that. I mean, obviously, once bitten, twice shy springs to mind in the case of Russia. But, also Russia's still quite involved in Syria and so on. So I don't really see why Russia would want to get bogged down in Afghanistan. And China would be, I think, quite averse to getting involved in that situation in a direct way. But obviously, they're both very much concerned about the security implications for Central Asia, and that's where the cooperation may continue. Although I have to say, it's not necessarily within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization grouping. China does tend to slightly annoy Russia by, I think, agreeing things on a bilateral basis with various Central Asian countries. So that would be an interesting dimension.
That's interesting. It seems we have a counterintuitive agreement on that. So Eugene, Rumer, could I put to you this question from YS Gill that has come up? Russia and your relations been stable since Soviet days. Would a fledgling Russia-China relationship adversely affect the India-Russia cooperation?
Fascinating question. The short answer is we don't know the answer to it. Really, it will take a lot of skillful diplomacy on the part of the Kremlin to navigate between these two, as presumably, well, I don't want to presume anything, but if in the event that the relationship between Beijing and New Delhi really continues to deteriorate. There's been a reversal of fortunes there, of course, that, the Russians to the present day, many still think that, India, that they kind of see themselves as the senior partner in this relationship, whereas tables have really turned, and Russia is seen widely as the country that has hit a rough patch, to say the least, and really is not increasing its stature on the world stage, whereas India is now on the upswing. So we'll see. It's interesting. The Russians have been courting Pakistan, looking at some arms sales, but also I think the recent meeting that the Russians hosted on Afghanistan, for some reason, did not include India. So this is the one to watch. My bet is that they will continue to walk this fine line, being friends and partners with both as far and as long as they can. And then they'll pretend that nothing bad is really happening. Sorry, Humphrey?
You put your finger on it there, because you've got the Russia-India relationship, the China-Pakistan relationship, and then we talked about the wider Indo-Pacific, where India is a member of the Quad. So you don't have Cold War clarity, really, do you, on what's sort of emerging there? I was wondering if I could put a speculative question to Marcin Kaczmarski here, which I'm going to try to show you there about, and I think I put a type of question like this to you before. Which issue would you see as the most likely to provoke future tension in the Sino-Russian relationship? Could you give us one?
If we are to look for such a question, I would speculate that it might be the Arctic, because the Arctic is this area in which within Russia itself there are two main views of the Arctic as a field of potential economic cooperation, which is where Russia needs China, but it is also the perspective on the Arctic as Russia's territory, which needs to be defended, the Arctic interpreted through the prism of sovereignty, and China's presence, China's talk about itself as a near Arctic state. The concept of the Polar Silk Road can be interpreted as this kind of infringement on what's Russian and should remain Russian.
Yeah, now that's fascinating, because they are cooperating a lot in the Arctic, aren't they, with shipping and icebreakers and all that, and also the energy deals that we heard from Maria Shagina. So could I put that same question to you, Maria Shagina? What is likely to be the future tension in the Sino-Russian relationship? Is it the Arctic?
It's a great question. I would slightly disagree with Marcin on the priorities, what can trigger the tensions between the two. I would say that the encroachment in each other's respective so-called spheres of interest, something that could be more sensitive. For example, Rosneft drilling near the disputed waters in Vietnam, something that is supposed, be Chinese spheres of interest, or China's increasing presence in Eastern Europe could be seen as a trigger, something that Russia sees as its own backyard. In the Arctic, because Russia is an Arctic littoral state, it has this power by default. It can define where China can go and when it cannot go. So China is fully aware that it needs Russia's concession on activities there. So it's treading very carefully. There are areas where it can overstep, but as I said in my talk, it has been reading Russia very well, and it knows where the thresholds are for now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You mentioned of Europe, of course, because there's the 17+1 that was the 16+1. I think it's now gone back to the 17+1 because Lithuania has pulled out. But this was this was, in a way, China's economic and political reach into what Russia could see as its backyard. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, all the panelists. We are now going to go to the chair of the Democracy Forum, Barry Gardner, who was elected to the British Parliament in 1997, an era when the West was viewed by both, or the West viewed this end of history thing, that liberal democracy was the end game in all development, and both China and Russia were seen as students that could slowly learn the art of Western democratic government. Well, we're all a lot wiser now. Good to work with you again, Barry, and over to you on your assessment of our debate.
Humphrey, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure, I have to say. And certainly the past 24 years have made me realize not only how stupid we were then, but also how stupid we are now. Sergey, I have to thank you particularly for telling us all just what it is that eternity looks like. You said that the unbreakable eternal treaty lasted for 10 years. Well, that will be a disappointment to those of us who want to live forever. Look, I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I actually think that the contributions by the people who put questions in the chat have been really important. Sergey talked about the way in which the two powers have learnt from history, and the importance of keeping close, not letting the USA play them against each other. Natasha pointed out that post-collapse, the USSR had that brief spell where it really contemplated moving in a liberal democratic direction, and we heard I think the echoes of that coming through later on when we were talking about territorial support, and Marcin, you talked about the failure of the two powers to support each other's territorial ambitions, and particularly over Crimea. I always remember Sir Peter Tatzel, who was briefly the father of the House a few years ago in the House of Commons, explaining to what was obviously a younger and less historically astute audience, namely the members of Parliament, that the reason Catherine the Great was called Catherine the Great was because of her securing that access into the Black Sea that Crimea constituted, and how important strategically that was. I think there were only 3 of us at that stage that were making a case to understand what was going on there in historical terms. Let me pick up what Dr. Natasha Kuhrt said, because I thought the way in which you articulated those 3 principles of what was anathema, if you like, separatism, fundamentalism, and terrorism. That I found a really interesting choice, and I would be very keen to hear you expound that more than you did. Because, of course, yes, separatism from within, secession, is absolutely anathema. Fundamentalism is something that I think certainly both powers have been accused of, and certainly one of them could be accused of exporting terrorism at the moment. We only need to look as locally as Winchester to recognize that here in the UK. But this concern to resist the challenge that the US presents of its leadership to the global regime, and the importance, I think, that you made around the issue of regime stability to both of them, I thought was very interesting. And it came back when we were talking about Russia as a disruptor. Because, of course, to be a disruptor, there has to be a stability that you disrupt. And stability can be important for different reasons to different powers. And I think you do see a divergence here between China and Russia in what they want out of the world order. China wanting to be a player, Russia seeing itself much more as a disruptor and a player through its disruption. Eugene made a very central point, it struck me, when he was talking about the relationship. He said, it is strong, and that's a good thing. We should recognize that actually it is a good thing. It would be a disaster probably in global politics if that relationship were not a strong one. And again, he stressed that political authoritarianism is something that is shared between them. The economic relationship is important, but it's very much the raw material supplier to the producer. And the strategic geopolitical partnership of each, in a sense, guarding the others back, Russia, Europe facing, China, Pacific facing. But the military cooperation, I thought it was important to, just to echo what he said about there is no, there's no NATO equivalent interoperability here. Yes, there may be competition over arms sales, but the partnership that exists here is not an integrated military force in the way that NATO's been. And again, I think he pointed out that Russia is gaining more from the partnership than China is from its partnership with Russia. The whole issue of the question that was posed about what might provoke future tension, I thought it was. Sorry, there's so much here that I've gleaned from what our speakers put. I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I just want to focus on this. Who can, where can the tension arise? And I think the question was posed perhaps in a way of how could one provoke it in response to those ideas that, how do we separate the two? How do we drive the two apart? But I actually think that there is a natural evolution that is going to take place over the next, it could be 30, 40 years. And it really did. It comes from what Dr. Maria Shagina was talking about, I thought very forcefully when she spoke about the energy policy and the energy relationship between the two. Because actually, China has taken climate change seriously in a way that Russia has not. And actually, that means their interests ultimately are going to diverge on this, and they're going to diverge sooner than I think we could actually drive them apart. The way in which China has embraced the challenge of climate change is seeking alternatives to hydrocarbons. Yes, recognizing its dependency for a period of time now, but actually moving beyond coal, moving to peak emissions, and seeing that as its future is something I think in stark contrast to Russia's view of climate change. And of course, Marcin picked that up, I think, in when he identified the Arctic as a key area of divergence. And of course, how long the Arctic remains the Arctic is the key question with climate change. So both parties unwilling to support each other's territorial ambitions, is perhaps the way in which one classically would see a divergence coming. I'm not so convinced that that is the way it will happen. I think the growing asymmetry is real, and when I think it was Marcin again spoke about the two parallel challenges, then I think what we're going to see gradually is this divergence of interests between the two. It will hold for quite a period of time, but I think ultimately these are countries that are going at the moment, certainly, in very different directions long term. And I think we need to think about a global response to that. So, Humphrey, I'll leave it there, but can I just thank everyone? I think it's been a fascinating session. I've learned a huge amount from it. As I say, I think the questions that were posed by those in the chat were really key to highlighting, as you did by bringing them in and focusing on them in your role as a moderator. Really contributed to what has been an extremely stimulating couple of hours.
Barry, thank you. And let's hope that we're not as stupid moving on or as blind moving on as we were when you first entered Parliament with all these dreams of Western democracy all over the world. Thank you, everybody. Our next panel is on the 14th of September. Same time, 2 to 4 UK time. I note 10:30 to 12:30 Afghanistan time, because the title is Afghanistan Filling the Void. A very apt title. If you can, get hold of our sister publication, Asian Affairs, which always goes a bit like these panels into the counterintuitive and untouched territory. Latest edition, read Bill Emmett, former editor of The Economist, the takeaways from Japan in the Olympics, and the Asian Affairs editor, Duncan Bartlett, on Bangladesh's innovative approach to helping the refugees from the Rohingya crisis, the largest refugee camp in the world. When we're thinking of Afghanistan, think of the Rohingyas. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, Sergey Radchenko, Natasha Kuhrt, Eugene Rumer, Marcin Kaczmarski, Maria Shagina, Barry Gardner, and the whole Democracy Forum team for putting together such an excellent panel. Much appreciated, making my job as moderator a lot easier. Thank you, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Goodbye and stay safe.
Yeah.